So here's the presentation summary. I will just give a little overview of the Eastern Townships. I use that term to refer to both the historical cultural region and the administrative region of l'Estrie, because it's a meaningful term for all communities. And I'll talk a little bit about the Eastern Townships and literary scenes within the region. I'll talk a little bit about murder mysteries and death stories, talk about murderscapes and deathscapes and possible interpretations of these. And then I'll finish, if there's time, with a short overview of the research project as a whole, so you can get a sense of how these literary studies elements fit with some of the more practice-based or creative writing or arts-based elements. So a little bit of context then. So bordering the United States, the Eastern Townships in southeastern Quebec are often popularly associated with Loyalist settlement. But as Anna highlighted in her introduction, the Wobanyaka, Abenaki lived there long before the arrival of settlers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. According to Guy Laperrière, the Americans who settled in the townships in the first half of the 19th century did so as part of a more generalized drive towards the north. During the same period, British and other Europeans moved into the region, as did Francophones from elsewhere in what was then Lower Canada. The region remains linguistically mixed, although it has moved from being primarily English-speaking in the 19th century to having French predominate in the 20th and 21st centuries. As many of you already know, the townships have long been tourist and leisure destinations, as evidenced in research such as Elizabeth Leanne Jewett's study of US tourists holidaying at Lake Memphremagog in the second half of the 19th century. Tourism remains strong, of course, in the present day, with organizations like Bonjour Québec and Tourism Eastern Townships drawing attention to the gastronomy, vineyards and microbreweries of the region, along with sports and exercise pursuits offered by the beautiful and varied physical geography, which includes lakes, forests and mountains. Almost unacknowledged, however, outside the region is the township's industrial history, which is linked to pulp, paper, asbestos, the railway and textiles. François Thierry Toé describes how technological developments overseas, the outsourcing of labour and other factors saw the first effects of the industrialisation in the 1950s in the region. By the turn of the millennium, the region was experiencing many of the traits associated with deindustrialisation worldwide, such as the decline of small towns, unemployment, and youth exodus. The 21st century has seen a huge interest in regions in Quebec literature, especially French language literature. And this, we can see this is part of a broader trend in literature more generally in comparable nations. Place writing is huge in the UK context at the moment too, and has been for 10 to 15 years. Particularly so-called new nature writing, so writing about the rural or semi-rural. So there's been a huge interest in regions in Quebec literature, but unlike some of the other regions celebrated in this 21st century literature, the Eastern Townships have historically had a long internationally recognized association with creative writing in both of Quebec's majority languages. Accordingly, Michael Bernazon describes the townships as one of two, and I quote, locale, or, and I quote, English literary activity, end of quote, in 20th century Quebec, with the other being Montreal. The primarily English language townships poetry scene reached its peak in the 1960s and included well-known writers like F.R. Scott, Louis Dudek, and Ralph Gustafson. Anyway, this poetry scene in the townships was fostered by the presence of institutions familiar to many of you, I'm sure, such as Champlain College and Bishop's University, both located in Sherbrooke. Another factor was that many writers of the time had holiday homes in the townships, which they visited regularly. Writing in 2007, Venison suggests, and I quote, "Township's literary production has slowly declined," end quote. And he's writing essentially about English language township literary production there. 15 years later, there may no longer be the same concentration of international English language poetry celebrities or celebrity poets in the region as there were 60 years ago. But poetry definitely remains active, as evidenced by collections like Waterlines, as you can see there, pictured there, and Emergence Contemporary Women Poets of the Eastern Townships of Québec. They're published in 2019 and 2021 respectively, and both edited by Angela Luck. As well as, of course, the more recent, the 2022 collection by Tanya Standish McIntyre, The House You Were Born In. Or the same, I would argue, that prose is becoming the main literary form associated with the townships. In English language prose, genre fiction, in English predominates and is thriving and flourishing, even if much of it is linked to a single author, murder mystery writer Louise Penny. Not surprisingly then, I'm going to focus on murder and death stories today, looking briefly at 3 examples before considering possible interpretations of the murder and deathscapes within them. So featured on the slide is just some of the English language texts that I'm considering in the broader project. So my first example then is Louise Penny's Still Life, published in 2005, the first book in her internationally best-selling 3-pound series, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. And here on the slide is a quotation from the book. Armand Gamache's deep brown eyes lingered on Jane Neal's liver-spotted brown hands, rough, tanned hands that had known seasons in a garden. No rings on her fingers or sign there ever had been. He always felt a pang when looking at the hands of the newly dead. The Still Life opens with a dead body in Fall Woods, that of 76-year-old Miss Jane Neal. Penny's opening chapter introduces us not only to the murder victim, but also to the key characters within the novel and ultimately series. These include the artists Clara and Peter Morrow, the poet Ruth Sardo, former psychologist and bookshop owner Myrna Landers, and Olivier Brûlé and Gabriel Dubois, a life and business couple who own and run a bistro and bed and breakfast. Crucially, the second character we encounter in Still Life is Armand Gamache, who, with his, and I quote, large expressive hands, end of quote, and Burberry Macintosh, is cast as both a figure of desire, Penny acknowledges he's modelled on her late husband, and a reassuring presence. My second example is from Denis Cooper's very successful novel Blind Shot, which published in 2019. And this opens with financier Paul Carignan getting shot whilst retrieving wood for the fire in his luxurious home in the imaginary township's county of Beaufort. And here we have the quotation. Paul fell over. With a gasp, he could feel his spirit struggling to leave him, wanting to fly up, chase the frightened crows, and disappear beyond the valley and over the dark woods. End of quote. Blind Shot, following this surprise shooting, goes on to dramatize family and community tensions within the county. And this third example, and I'm sorry, there's very kind of summary or very quick looks at glances, tantalizing glimpses at these texts because of time restrictions. But the third example is from Leanne Keightley's short story, 10-Cent Packs, from the collection 7 Openings of the Head. And here we have, the evidence is there, and sender has left his fingerprints all over the back of my knee. In Keightley's story, an unnamed female protagonist stays at her grandmother's house for longer than she originally intends, following the elderly woman's death. She interacts to a small degree with her neighbours, especially 30-something Sender and his dog Milo, but otherwise does little besides stockpile canned goods and plan winter menus, even though it is summer. Sender, whose house, and I quote, smells faintly of urine, end of quote, watches daytime TV when he's not working, leaving Milo to run about unmonitored outside. Sender's recently separated from his partner, who calls one day to say she wants custody of Milo. The dog disappears shortly afterwards. Towards the end of the story, the protagonist is woken by the smell of the corn she planted from old seed packets she found in her grandmother's house, which has been cut down. Shortly afterwards, at Sender's request, she goes with him to see Milo's body, which he claims to have found, although it is clear that the protagonist is unconvinced by this explanation. The encounter is made more unsettling by the eroticism of the description of the protagonist and Sender going on to, and I quote, lean back on slow rotting apples, end of quote. So it's not uncommon for non-urban areas to be associated with the murder mystery, from 1920s and 1930s whodunits that unsettle popular conceptions of the rural as pastoral idyll, the various forms of the noir that have enjoyed popularity in the 21st century. I'm thinking here of things like Scandi noir, which of course have been, examples of which have of course been made by countries such as Wales, not just Scandinavian. Setting then is central to this genre. These recent, especially recent examples of it, and this is underlined by Gary J. Houseladden in his work on what he terms, and I quote, place-based police procedures, end of quote. Analysing a corpus that includes series set in New Orleans, Hong Kong, London, Amsterdam and Provence, amongst other cities and regions, Houseladden highlights, and I quote, place becomes an essential, maybe the essential plot element, end of quote. He goes on to outline the play between the new and familiar operated by such texts, linking newness to locale and familiarity to, and I quote, situations and circumstances, end of quote. Some townships murder mysteries, however, undermine this neat mapping, cannily combining a degree of newness and place exoticism, achieved through highlighting regional specificities with more familiar notions, so place familiarity then, which is achieved through a framing of a rendering of the region through other places connected with the murder mystery and associated subgenres. Accordingly, Penny's depiction of Three Pines might be informed by real-life Norton, offering fictional versions of businesses like Broom Lake Books, but this is a Norton that resembles English villages found in canonical examples of the whodunit by Agatha Christie and others. For its part, Blindshot reprises elements of hillbilly Gothic, notably in the character of Geoffrey Lennox. A violent man, Lennox is land rich but money poor, as suggested by the seasonal labour he undertakes and the cheap whiskey he drinks. As member of both the rural landowning class and socio-economic quasi-underclass, Lennox is tolerated by his long-term township of friends. Comprising a police chief, an accountant, and an artisanal gunmaker, Lennox's lower middle class and middle class blue and white collar pals represent a midpoint between the very rich and semi-poor in the region. Many of them form an effectively self-governing body, working together to evade provincial and federal law or adapt these laws to their own ends. The very rich are represented by a relatively small number of wealthy families, many of whom live most of the year in Montreal, Western Canada, or the United States, who have bought up swathes of Beaufort County and turned them into private estates. For these second homeowners, the region is just, and I quote, a vast forested playground. There's a connection here with 10 Cent Parks, which is not a murder mystery story. The death or murderscapes within it's more of a death story, because the death or murderscapes within it are mundane. In the case of the protagonist's grandmother, who had lived a long life, or else associated with a non-human or natural world. As Jeanette Sloniowski and Marilyn Rose point out, the murder mystery is the most popular novelistic form worldwide. In taking up this form, writers know they will likely attract larger audiences and typically read and buy literary fiction. And that's not a quality judgment at all. I love middlebrow fiction and I love genre fiction. I should have perhaps said at the start, that I'm sure it's evident in the way I'm speaking about this work, that I'm a huge fan of murder mysteries. So, there's also a question of the real affection and the genuine affection for the townships that informs the work of authors who have moved there or spent significant time in the region. Indeed, Penny has repeatedly spoken and written about her fondness for the townships, and her stellar success is bound up in her particular representations of the region, which highlight aspects of townships' village life, whilst rendering Knowlton a kind of Devon or Dorset village. Hoople and Kitely both have attachments to the townships too. So while Still Life and Blindshot would likely satisfy fans anywhere in the world with their deft negotiations of genre conventions, the framing of the townships as murderscapes and deathscapes by these authors and others, including Kitely, invites post-colonial, eco-critical and cultural materialist readings that are specific to the region. Townships' murder mysteries can be seen as haunted by the violence of settler colonialism and repressed histories of slavery. Violence within the genre can also be read as a tracing of devastation caused to the other than human or natural world via deforestation, pollution of water sources, and other extractive practices. Finally, the apparent emptiness of the settings of some of the examples of townships' murder and death stories suggest a region in economic decline. Indeed, the townships can be said to have a deindustrialization literature, albeit one that differs from examples associated with the US Rust Belt or English Midlands, in that it does not necessarily focus on working class or blue-collar labour practices or daily life. So just talk a little bit more about the broader project at this point. So Heartlands Pays du Cœur is a two-stranded project with an analytical strand, there's a kind of literary studies strand that looks at literary geographies or place then in published fiction and creative nonfiction, and a research practice strand that sees me working with artists and community members to create new artistic responses to the region. These artistic responses include a digital map, an audio walk, a contemporary dance or performance, new creative writing, and other art forms. And these other art forms are generated often via participatory workshops and events. So there'll be the digital map will feature, is being made, with media artists Kelsey Swain and Yannick Guéguin, and will feature audio recordings of writers reading short extracts of their texts that are set in the region, and then they'll be pinned to the map. So you just see on the slide, you just see an example of some of my writing, but if the end result will feature writers who've written on the region and who live in Quebec. And here's some of the examples of the English language writers featured on the map that Kelsey and I recorded in the kind of early summer. So there's Jenny Kubal, author of Blindshot, Leanne Kitely, author of Ted St. Pax, Louise Abbott, who has a creative nonfiction piece included in the map, and Ross Murray, who's got a humoristic piece about the border featured in the map, and Nick Fonda, who's also written a novel about a murder, a historical novel, an extract of which is also included. And recordings were, for the most part, carried out at either Planet Studios in Montreal or Studio C in Sherbrooke, although in the case of Louise Abbott, we recorded her in the countryside at Cello Vision Productions. There's Québec. The audio walk, which I'm making in conjunction with media artist Philip Lichty, is after some consideration, it was likely based on the number of texts set in places. It was going to be either set in Sherbrooke or Magog, because those feature time and again in texts by authors. But in the end, I opted for Magog because it was a more walkable side. I personally don't drive. I find Sherbrooke a really drivable city rather than a walkable city. It's also very important to me to have a route that is accessible. So I have some mobility issues myself following Lyme disease and COVID and long-COVID. It was really important for me to have a site that was accessible. So I chose a symbolic site, which runs along the lakefront of Magog. It's already a site that is greatly used. It's an accessible site. There are car parks, public washrooms, water fountains, and there are viewing platforms, one of which is a ramp as well as steps. So that was really important for me to choose that site. And I tried to script an audio walk that would be specific to that site, but also bring in other areas within the region, and that would be an art work in its own right, that would be interesting for people who are listening internationally as well. And there are creative prompts within it. So it's not just about kind of passive listening, but it's also, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can make your own artworks and artworks prompted by the war. And trialed the audio walk in late July with members of the Geopoetics research group, La Traversée. I've been a long-term, I myself am a long-term member, so we trialed it with them and with some members from the Centre for Oral History and Digital Storytelling at Concordia. I'm an affiliate of that. There we are setting out, and there we are just starting some of the feedback, and then I slightly amended the script of the walk following some of that feedback. And here I am trying out a professional recording myself of the script of the audio walk. So then, just to summarize, the research undertaken for the literary geographies elements of the project inform the collaborative and participatory artworks and activities of the research practice elements or thread and vice versa, in an interplay that's quite typical of much critical creative work. As we know, if we've ever belonged to a book club or known friends or family members belonging to book clubs, participating in reading cultures does not always or necessarily require much actual reading. Users, readers of the digital map and audio walk, and participants in the creative workshops and activities attached to the project, to the Heartlands Québécois project, will not themselves be expected to read the hundreds of novels, short story collections, and memoirs set in the townships. Although an initial trial of the audio walk held in July was very successful, it remains to be seen, of course, what users, readers, listeners will make of it and the digital map in the future. In any case, I hope the project as a whole will mediate my own love of the townships, as well as give a sense of the interconnectedness of places and beings, pasts and presents, bringing together an engagement in reading cultures, writing, broadly conceived, places and bodies. Thank you.
And we now have time for questions from the audience. And I do have a question for you, Ceri. So you studied both Francophone and Anglophone literature from the townships, and you spent a lot of time there. You were there this summer. And I wanted to know if you have noticed, what distinct elements, of any, have you noticed about the English-speaking community in the townships from your study and also from being there, if anything?
So I think I think there are probably other people who could answer this question more, able to answer this question than me. As anybody who's looked me up will know, I've worked for a lot longer on French language literature from Quebec than I have from English language literature. And I would say it's kind of hard. I think it's sort of hard to make generalization. Now, I've made this point in relation to Montreal fiction in English, whereas it's quite easy to talk about broad trends in French language fiction set in Montreal. The Montreal novel is a studied object, in the way the Toronto novel and Vancouver novel has only been, they've only been constituted as objects of study in the last 10, 20 years, whereas the Montreal novel has been studied for, 50 plus years. Although it's quite easy to talk about broad trends in the French language Montreal novel, it's harder to do so in the English language Montreal novel. I think that's, and I would say it's kind of harder. So I was thinking about this earlier, for one thing, I think, other people belonging to or associated with QUESCREN, including Patrick, are probably better equipped to answer this question. But for another thing, I think it's sort of hard to make kind of generalizations or clear at this point, anyway. At least I would say that, and some of my some of what I'm going to say might be a bit impressionistic. I had a sense, certainly from elements within the English language, amongst English language writers, that there was a sense of vulnerability, and with things changing from how perhaps they had been in previous decades. But I think things might vary, but from according to age as well, where people are in the life course, where people might live. Because other writers I spoke to sort of belonged to English language writing groups and really had a sense of that as being something quite thriving. So it's kind of hard for me. I don't think there is a single answer to that question, to be honest.
So we do have some questions in the question and answer for you, so I'm going to pose them to you now. So our first one is from, yes, thank you for the people who started asking questions. The first one is from Natalie Cook, pardon. And she asked, what was the name of the book that you mentioned that describes tourism in Methmagog in the 19th century? She says she's usually in Vale Perkins, but at McGill today.
Elizabeth Leanne Jewett, Jewett, is the author.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's actually,
it's from the Journal of Eastern Townships Studies, 31, published in 2007.
Great, thank you. That last name, Jewett, is a very famous one in this region.
Ah, okay.
That's why I got my attention a bit.
We have a question from Lorraine O'Donnell, who is senior researcher at QUESCREN. She asks if you have done any work with the Québec Anglophone Heritage Network. They have an ongoing project called Scandal Makers.
No, not yet.
Not yet. Is anyone from the Québec Anglophone Heritage Network here? Kwan? I think I saw someone.
Yeah, I am Sandra. I'm a director with Kwan. Yes, we've had a series of short films produced mainly by Heather Darsh, who has been a participant and a director and an employee, and a longtime Eastern Townships resident. They mainly dwell on various people who were unusual in their time, and they're set near the person's tombstone in various cemeteries in the townships. And they're a good cross-section of course, mainly former residents of the Eastern Townships who were either famous or notorious in their day, okay? So they're really worth tuning into. They're very, very well done. And we've also have been encouraging other kinds of film and so on that deal with heritage and history. So you could go to our website and wander around. You'll find out a lot. We also have a 4-time-a-year magazine called Quebec Heritage News. And over the number of years I've been with Quan, I've had the fun and privilege of writing quite a few book reviews, including the one by Nick Fonda about the murder on the railway. I wrote a review of that. So Nick has also been a prolific writer for a long time. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much.
Me.
I was in a funny. It was if you remember the slide with the featuring Nick, we were actually in a cafe, and at the same time as I was interviewing Nick, well, I interviewed Nick for the project, but then he also interviewed me for the newspaper. Which is very funny. But I will say, I mean, I found it more of a challenge. I mean, obviously, I had an advantage in that I was already very well embedded in French language academic and literary communities. I have found it in some ways a bit of a challenge to. I knew some English language writers. I'm not saying I don't know any. I know quite a few, really, but. For example, I contacted the Townships Association. They didn't write back to me. I wrote Rome Lake Books. They didn't write back to me. I've had some more challenges from that perspective than I have elsewhere.
Okay.
Okay, I suggest that you get in touch with the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. They will get back to you, and the office is in Lennoxville. Okay.
Okay, that's great to know. So can I just make a plug for a Lennoxville event? So at the end of October, as a kind of part of this project, I'm going to be hosting an open mic event at Black Cat Books, because Black Cat Books did get back to me. So a place writing event at the Black Cat Books in Lennoxville. That Black Cat Books will announce that.
Okay.
If you have a link to that, feel free to share it in the chat, or one of my colleagues maybe can do a bit of sleuthing and find that. Otherwise, we'll share that with our participants following the event as well. So if anyone's in the area